Assalamu alaikum and very good morning to all of you. In Lahore, it's a nice, cool, breezy morning, a cloudy morning, I must say. Gee, so we had started doing the development of pharyngeal apparatus. I'll give you a quick recap of how the pharyngeal apparatus develops. सबसे पहले तो मुझे ये बताइए कि what's the development of pharyngeal apparatus, whatever little we did. Was it clear to you? Any questions regarding the previous lecture? Or any other question now that you have a substation coming up on Tuesday? Do you have any questions regarding that? I guess not. So let's start with I'll give you a quick recap of the development of pharyngeal apparatus. Pharyngeal apparatus, this is the developing pharynx. The pharynx is the cranial most part of the foregut. This is the endoderm lining the inside of the developing pharynx. This pink is mesoderm, surrounding the pharynx all around. And then on the outside, this is ectoderm. So you have endoderm lining the cavity of the pharynx. Immediately outside the endoderm, you have mesenchyme or mesoderm, and then you have the ectoderm. Now, this mesenchyme surrounding the pharynx, this in places it gets condensed to form bars or rods. Lateral wall and anterior aspect of the pharynx, mesenchyme condenses to form 6 rods. In between these rods are intervals in which the mesenchyme is not condensed, loose mesenchyme. So you have a rod or a bar of condensed mesenchyme, then alternating with loose mesenchyme. Just have a spread your fingers, अपनी उंगलियां फैला लें और उसको देखें. Your fingers are rods of condensed mesenchyme, और जो fingers के दरमियान gap है, that is the area where you have loose mesenchyme. Then you have condensed mesenchyme, then loose mesenchyme, alternate. So now these rods of condensed mesenchyme are your pharyngeal arches. In between, you have 6 pharyngeal arches. 5th wali jo hai, that is rudimentary, and it either is never formed, or if it is formed, it somehow disappears. So from cranial to caudal order sequence mein, you have pharyngeal arch number 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have 6. In Messi, the first 3 are very prominent. They are visible on the surface of the developing pharynx. But 4th and 6th, they are present all right, but they are not prominently visible. So significant appearance unki nazar nahi aati on the surface of the pharynx. But yes, when you take a cut section, you do have, you see these arches, number 4 and 6, even though they are not prominently visible on the surface of the pharynx. So in between two pharyngeal arches, you have loose mesenchyme. So you have a pharyngeal arch, then you have loose mesenchyme. All of these, be it loose mesenchyme or condensed, on the inside it is lined by endoderm, and on the outside it is lined by ectoderm. So what happens is, now this is the area where you have loose mesenchyme. So the endoderm lining the inside of the developing pharynx. This endoderm is pushed out. This pushed out endoderm, this is called a pharyngeal pouch. And this ectoderm lining the outside of this loose area of mesenchyme, this is pushed inwards. This pushing inwards of mesenchyme, of ectoderm, this pushing inwards of ectoderm is called pharyngeal groove or pharyngeal cleft. Yeah, this is pharyngeal groove or pharyngeal cleft. Now, the ectoderm bulges in, the endoderm bulges out. The two approach each other, the two come very close to each other, they meet each other. In between the endoderm and the bulging in ectoderm, there is trapped a little bit of mesenchyme. So these two, the ectoderm and endoderm, they approach each other. Where they meet each other, that area is called pharyngeal membrane. So this is where the endoderm of the developing pharynx and the ectoderm lining the outside of the pharyngeal pouch, lining the outside of mesenchyme, the loose area where you have loose mesenchyme. So these two approach each other, meet each other. They have a little bit of mesenchyme trapped in between. This is called pharyngeal membrane. So now let's formally go into the components of a pharyngeal arch. Every pharyngeal arch has four components. It has a skeletal component. From the skeletal component develops either a bone or a cartilage. Okay. There always develops a bone or a cartilage. It may remain or it will disappear. Okay. But the skeletal component consists of either a bone or a cartilage. And then comes a muscle component. ये muscle जो है, this is a striated muscle. Always a striated muscle. इसमें smooth muscle नहीं होगा. ठीक है. अब ये muscles की आगे varieties है. It may divide into a number of muscles. It may remain as a single muscle. But remember one thing. Wherever it develops, it is supplied by the component of that nerve. The third component of the pharyngeal arch is the nerve of the arch, and that happens to be a cranial nerve or a branch of a cranial nerve. And the fourth component is a pharyngeal arch artery. Okay. So the muscle is supplied by the nerve of the arch, and wherever the muscle migrates, it carries its nerve with it. एक example आपको मैंने उस दिन भी diaphragm का दिया था. Okay, diaphragm develops in the cervical region, but then it is in the cervical region. It is supplied by third, fourth, and fifth segment of the cervical nerve. C3, 4, 5 होता है, which makes up the phrenic nerve. But then from the cervical region, the diaphragm travels to the forms a partition between the thorax and the abdomen, and in the process of its migration, it carries the phrenic nerve with it. Arterial component जो है, that joins the aortic sac, pharyngeal arch artery है, join the aortic sac to the dorsal aorta, and the nerve of the arch. Every arch is supplied by a cranial nerve or a branch of a cranial nerve. ठीक है, जो कि मसल को भी सप्लाई करते हैं, मसल्स ऑफ दैट पर्टिकुलर आर्च, प्लस इट सप्लाइज सेंसरी ब्रांचेस टू द dermis and connective tissue. अब pharyngeal arch की हमने बात की थी, उसका फेट क्या था? First pharyngeal arch structures develop from the second pharyngeal arch. I told you the second pharyngeal arch begins to grow caudally. It grows down. It overlaps the third and the fourth pharyngeal arches. Okay. It grows caudally till it meets the cardiac eminence. As it is growing caudally, the third and the fourth arch are overlapped by the growing second arch. There's a gap between the second arch and the third and fourth arch. This gap is in the form of a cleft. This is called cervical sinus. So the third and fourth arch are actually lying in this depression. This cervical sinus communicates with the exterior, but then the second arch fuses with the mesenchyme overlying the cardiac eminence, and the third and fourth arch are buried inside the cervical sinus. The communication between the cervical sinus and the exterior, this is blocked, and there's one continuous mesenchyme starting from the second arch down to the cardiac eminence, overlying the third and fourth arch. This continuous mesenchyme gives the neck a smooth appearance. और ये जो cervical sinus जो था, this remains there for a while, a transitory structure है, and then gradually this also disappears. Okay, Ji, what develops from the first arch? The first arch, I told you, has two components, a maxillary component and a mandibular component. The maxillary component is the dorsal posterior aspect पे होता है, and it is underlying the eyes. Okay, so it is over here. This is the developing brain. Over here you have the eyes. So the part of the first arch under the eyes is called the maxillary component, and the ventral part. This is the ventral part. This is the mandibular component. अब इस arch की दो cartilages होती हैं, एक Meckel's cartilage है and एक quadrate bone. जिससे cartilages, जिससे bones develop, the face develop होती है. But just remember Meckel's cartilage. That is enough for you. So Meckel's cartilage, I told you, is a long cartilage from the posterior end to the anterior end. From the posterior end develops these two bones. Meckel's cartilage, posterior end जो है, that gets broken up into small pieces. These pieces develop into two bones of the middle ear cavity. Bone is os. A small bone is an ossicle. So you have incus. The incus hai, and this is the malleus. Middle part of the cartilage disappears, but the pericordium persists. This develops into the anterior ligament of the malleus. This ligament is connected to the malleus. Then you have this is the anterior ligament of the malleus, and then comes this part, sphenomandibular ligament, spine of the sphenoid and mandible, extending part of the cartilage extending between the spine of sphenoid and the mandible. This is the sphenomandibular ligament. The ventral part of the cartilage, this persists. Around this cartilage, the mesenchyme condenses and develops into the mandible. You can see this is the mandible. Okay? When the mandible, primordium of the mandible, when it is formed, it develops by intramembranous ossification, because you know the bones that have to give support to the structures, surrounding structures in the early intrauterine life, they develop by intramembranous ossification. So this mandible has to give support to the developing jaw. So when the mandible develops by intramembranous ossification, this cartilage, the Meckel's cartilage, the ventral end of the Meckel's cartilage, this gradually disappears. Okay. अच्छा जी, अब आपको बताया था कि the first arch has two components, a maxillary component and a mandibular component. Mandibular component हमने develop कर दिया, उससे mandible develop हुई. Maxillary component जो था उसका, उससे ये premaxilla, इधर maxilla, zygomatic bone. This is the temporal bone. Zygomatic bone, you all know, is part of the temporal bone. So this is the zygomatic process. This is the temporal bone. All these one continuous structure, they develop from the first maxillary process of the first pharyngeal arch. And you already know that we did it in the development of the skull, that this temporal and the zygomatic process, the temporal bone and its zygomatic process, they then are dragged posteriorly and they become part of the skull. Development हुई थी first pharyngeal arch से, but then they became part of the skull. All these bones develop by intramembranous ossification because you all know that they have to give support to the developing phase. Muscles of the first arch. Muscles of mastication, temporalis, masseter, median and lateral, pterygoid. Anterior belly of digastric. Now this is the digastric muscle है, ये इसकी anterior belly. This is the anterior belly of the digastric, mylohyoid, and then you have the muscle of the palate called tensor palati and tympanic cavity या middle ear cavity का muscle है, इसको tensor tympani. All these muscles develop from the mesenchyme in the first arch. The nerve of the first arch is the fifth cranial nerve. Basically, it's the mandibular component of the fifth cranial nerve. Mandibular, आपको पता है, nerve is a mixed nerve. It has sensory and motor fibers. The motor fibers in the mandibular nerve, they supply the muscles. All these muscles that I've mentioned, they are all supplied by the mandibular nerve, which is the nerve of the first arch. And then some fibers from maxillary also, which is the second division. Mandibular is the third division of the trigeminal. The second division is maxillary, that gives sensory fibers to the dermis of the skin, face, teeth, mucous membranes of the nose, palate, etc. All these are supplied by the maxillary division. The artery of the first arch, हम arteries in detail discuss कर चुके हैं जब हमने heart की vascular system की development की. The artery of the first arch regresses, only part of it persists, that develops into maxillary artery, and some books mention external carotid as well. But maxillary every book mentions. So remember maxillary. And as I told you earlier on, you have to memorize all these things as it is. In fact, ये solid marks का question होता है. Enumerate the structures developing in the first arch structure. So उसमें आसान है. You start from the cartilage component, skeletal muscle component. You then mention the nerve and the artery. Yeah, इस तरह भी enumerate the muscles that are developed in the first arch. इस तरह. This is just to give you solid marks. अच्छा जी. Before we go on to the second arch, do we have any questions, Beta? Do we have any questions? I guess not. So let's move ahead. Second arch की बात कर लेते हैं. Second arch की जो cartilage है, that is called Richters cartilage. इसका भी उसी तरह ही एक dorsal end है. This diagram is taken from your book, KLM. ये Langland की drawing है, because इस जैसी कोई drawing आपकी किताब में जिसमें ये फर्स्ट आर्च के मैक्सिलरी कंपोनेंट की स्ट्रक्चर्स जो हैं उनकी डेवलपमेंट दिखाई गई है ये KLM में नहीं थी. So before I go any further, this is the hyoid bone. This is the great body of the hyoid bone. ठीक है? This is the body of the hyoid bone. This projection is a lesser horn of the hyoid bone, and this is the greater horn of the hyoid bone. So the body of the hyoid bone, lesser horn of the hyoid bone, and this is the greater horn of the hyoid bone. बस इतनी ही होती है hyoid bone, इससे ज़्यादा नहीं होती. The second arch is also called excuse me, the hyoid arch. The second arch is called the hyoid arch, and the cartilage of the second arch is called Ritsch's cartilage. ये इसका नाम लिखा है, Ritsch's cartilage. इसके भी दो एंड्स हैं, एक डोर्सल एंड है, एक वेंट्रल एंड है. The dorsal end of the second arch cartilage. तो हम cartilage की बात कर रहे हैं, skeletal component की. The dorsal end develops into a small bone, which is called a stapes. This is the third bone of the middle ear cavity. दो हमने first arch से develop की थी, incus medius. This is the third bone, stapes. This develops from the second arch. इस dark green को follow कीजिए. This is जहाँ पे आपको dark green नजर आएगा, that is the second arch. So third bone of the cartilage develop होती है from the third bone of the middle ear cavity develop होती है from the cartilage of the second arch. Plus you have this small bone, the styloid process. Styloid process अगर आपको याद हो तो हमने base of skull में देखा था. ठीक है? So the dorsal part of the cartilage, Ritsch's cartilage, a second arch cartilage, develops into stapes and styloid process. Middle part, जिसमें पहले किया था हमने discuss, the middle part regresses, only the perichondrium is left. This perichondrium develops into stylohyoid ligament. So this is the stylohyoid ligament. Starting from the styloid process, going on to the hyoid bone. And then comes this structure, which is the hyoid bone. The ventral end of this cartilage, this develops into the lesser horn and the upper half of the body. यहाँ पे दिखा देती हूँ, lesser horn and the upper half of the body, ये area. This develops from the second arch. So ये green में part देख लीजिए. This is the lesser horn and this is the upper half of the body of the hyoid bone. अच्छा जी, muscles of the second arch में एक तो stapedius है, muscles of the middle ear cavity is stapedius. Then is this muscle, stylohyoid. You have the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, ये वाला. ये हमने anterior belly first arch से develop हुई. The posterior belly develops from the second arch. And this is the auricularis muscle, also developing from the second arch. And then, of course, don't forget, muscles of facial expression. All these develop from the mesenchyme in the second arch. Nerve of the second arch is seventh cranial nerve, which is your facial nerve. And the artery of the second arch is the stapedial artery, middle ear cavity में होती है, but then intrauterine life में होती है, but then it regresses. Adults में इसका कोई आपको ये मिलता है. So I repeat once again, second arch को मैं repeat कर देती हूँ. Second arch की जो cartilage है, इसका एक dorsal end है और एक ventral end है. Dorsal end develops into the stapes. Dorsal end also develops into the styloid process. Stapes this is the third bone of the middle ear cavity, and standard bone of the skull. The intermediate part regresses, but the perichondrium persists. The cartilage part in the intermediate region of the Richter's cartilage that regresses, the perichondrium develops into stylohyoid ligament. The ventral part develops into the lesser horn of the hyoid bone and the upper half of the body of the hyoid bone. Muscles may you have muscle of the middle ear cavity, which is the stapedius. This is the stylohyoid, the posterior belly of the digastric, auricular muscle, and muscle of facial expression. Here once again, Langmuir की drawing. Then is the nerve of the arch is the seventh cranial nerve, which is the facial nerve, and artery of the arch is stapedial artery, which regresses. Middle ear की होती है, but then it regresses. Adults में इसका कोई counterpart नहीं होता. Third arch. Once again, let's start with the cartilage. इसका सिर्फ ventral end रह जाता है, posterior end of the third arch cartilage regresses. This ventral end now develops into the greater horn and the lower part of body of hyoid bone. ये I'll go back. ये part the greater horn and lower part of body of hyoid bone develops from the third arch cartilage. Muscles में से एक ही muscle है, and that is the stylopharyngeus. Nerve is the ninth cranial nerve, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and artery is the common carotid artery. Even internal carotid is developed. Okay. So I go over it once again. Third arch, the cartilage component, only the ventral end persists. So the cartilage component develops into the greater horn of the hyoid bone and lower half of the body of the hyoid bone. Muscles में there is just one muscle, and that is stylopharyngeus, muscle of the pharynx. Nerve जो है glossopharyngeal nerve or ninth cranial nerve है, and artery is the common carotid and internal carotid. Any questions so far before I go on to the next arch? Fine, कोई नहीं. अच्छा जी, fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches, I told you they are not very well developed. So we take them together. Fifth, though I told you, regress कर जाती है. Fifth arch regresses, either does not develop at all, or if it develops, it regresses because no component of the fifth arch is seen. Even the fourth and sixth arch, they do not make up any significant elevation on the surface of the arch. अच्छा जी, skeletal structures क्या हैं? Skeletal structures of the fourth and sixth arch. I mean, first start with the fourth arch. The skeletal structures, they make up the cartilages of the arch. They make up the cartilage of the larynx. So laryngeal cartilages develop from the cartilage of the fourth arch. इनमें thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, arytenoid cartilage, corniculate cartilage, and cuneiform. ये cartilages हैं of the fourth arch. The thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, arytenoid cartilage, corniculate cartilage, and cuneiform cartilage. अच्छा, nerve of the, अब इन दोनों की जो nerve है, that comes from the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. ठीक है. Fourth arch को supply करती है vagus nerve की superior laryngeal branch, और sixth arch को supply करती है vagus nerve की recurrent laryngeal branch. दोनों arches को vagus nerve ही supply करती है. The fourth through its superior laryngeal branch, the sixth through its recurrent laryngeal branch. अच्छा, मसल्स देख लेते हैं. इस आर्च के मसल्स कौन से हैं. अब लैरिंग्स को सप्लाई किया है तो उससे रिलेटेड हो गए. सो फोर्थ आर्च के जो मसल्स हैं, they are cricothyroid, levator palatii, and constrictors of the phalanx. और सिक्स्थ आर्च के मसल्स में intrinsic muscles of the larynx and striated muscles of the upper part of the esophagus. Artery of this arch, fourth and sixth arch, right and left pulmonary artery. Okay, so that finishes with the pharyngeal arches. Any question before I go on to pharyngeal pouches? You can next up pharyngeal pouches. Do you have any questions? इसमें problem कोई नहीं है. All that you need to do is you have to memorize them as they are. Actually, so I see there are no questions. That's very good. Let's go on to the pouches. I told you that the endoderm of the developing pharynx, endoderm lines the interior of the developing pharynx. The developing pharynx है. Endoderm, ये endoderm ऐसा है. ठीक है. This indents inwards. It goes inwards, and this inward movement, this is called a pouch. This forms a pouch. So the first pouch is formed between the first and second arch. First pharyngeal arch, second pharyngeal arch, third pharyngeal arch, fourth pharyngeal arch. So between the first and second arch, you have the first pharyngeal pouch. Between the second and third arch, you have the second pharyngeal pouch. Between the third and fourth pharyngeal arch, you have the third pharyngeal pouch. I hope this thing is clear to you. In humans, we have 5 pouches. The fifth pouch is rudimentary. ठीक है? उसके अलावा every pouches, first 4 pouches, all of them, they have, as they grow in, they form this dilated area, and from this dilated area, you have 2 ends growing. One end grows dorsally, the other end grows ventrally. ये dorsal and ventral growing ends जो है, इनको wings कहते हैं. I repeat once again. Pharyngeal pouch is formed by the migration of endoderm that turns in between the two arches. Pharyngeal pouch, ये जो loose mesenchyme है, in between 2 arches. The endoderm pushes in. When it moves in, it forms this dilated area and 2 extensions, a dorsal extension, a ventral extension. These dorsal and ventral extensions, they are called wings. Okay? Remember one thing. These extensions are present in all the pouches. लेकिन कुछ में they are well developed in some pouches, in the other pouches they are not that well developed. और होती सब में है. Is this thing clear? Okay, I guess it is. बेटा जो first pouch है ना, that has to be remembered as the pouch that develops into structures of the mid layer. The structures related to the mid layer cavity develop from the first pouch. ठीक है, अब कैसे develop होते हैं? इसका जो ventral या anterior ring है ना, वो obliterate हो जाता है because that takes part in the formation of the tongue. ठीक है, so ventral end obliterate हो जाता है. अब dorsal end आएगी. Dorsal wing जो है that expands. अब ये dorsal wing कहते हैं second pouch को join कर लेता है. दरमियान में ये जो dilated part था, this develops into this structure. Sorry. ये जो dilated part in the center था, ये वाला part develops into tubotympanic recess. So the dilated part is the tubotympanic recess. This recess then develops into the mid-layer cavity. Or the connection between this dilated part called tubotympanic cavity, which is a mid-layer cavity developing. The connection between this and the developing pharynx. ये pharynx है, ये endoderm went inside like this. अब ये जो connection है between this pouch and the pharynx, ये connection इस first arch में persist करता है, and this connection develops into what we call is the auditory tube. ठीक है, तो ये जो आपको बताया था कि ये जो recess है, this develops into mid-layer cavity and mastoid antrum. बेटा mastoid process में आपने study किया था इस काल में. इस mastoid process में mastoid air cells होते हैं and एक space भी होती है between the mastoid air cells. There is a little space which is called mastoid antrum. So that mastoid antrum and this mid-layer cavity, this develops from the first pharyngeal pouch, the dorsal wing, because आपको बताया है कि the ventral wing obliterates. And this proximal end communicates with the pharynx. It's long and narrow, communicates with the pharynx and develops into, this communication develops into the auditory tube. That is why the auditory tube or the eustachian tube, this connection जो है between the mid-layer cavity and the pharynx, this persists throughout life. ठीक है बेटा? So that is why you will go and study a little later that the auditory tube develops, opens into the pharynx. That is why any infection in the pharynx can be carried through this auditory tube. Any problem in the pharynx, any infection in the pharynx is carried through this auditory tube into the mid-layer cavity. कान में दर्द शुरू हो जाता है. Infection गले में होती है, दर्द कान में शुरू हो जाता है. ये आपने बहुत दफा एक्सपीरियंस किया होगा. अच्छा जी, अब सेकंड पंच पे आ जाते हैं. Before I start on to the second pouch, do you have any questions? I guess not. It's fairly easy. Abhi tak to. Now comes the part which is a little tricky. Second pouch, उसी तरह in between the second and third pharyngeal arch. उसी तरह the endoderm moving inwards, forming two wings, the dorsal and the ventral wing. अब इसका dorsal wing जो है, it is questionable है, लेकिन it communicates with the dorsal wing of the first pouch, and so it communicates with the tuberosum recess. But what you have to remember is that the ventral wing is extremely important for you, because the ventral wing develops into this structure which is called palatine tonsil. ये आपने first year में इसकी histology पढ़ी थी, palatine tonsil. So the ventral wing develops into the palatine tonsil. ये आपको याद रखनी है, इस पे आपका university question आता है, give the development of the palatine tonsil. I don't know why it is so favorite with the examiners. Anyway, palatine tonsil, I hope आपको structure याद होगा. Okay. It was lined by stratified squamous epithelium. This epithelium then moved inward to form crypts. And ये जो endoderm है, lining this pouch, this proliferates. Rapid proliferation say it fills in the cavity of the pouch, and hence a solid mass of endodermal cells ये बन जाता है. Now these endodermal cells then begin to penetrate into the underlying mesenchyme. ये इस तरह से, ये endodermal cells, ये जो red है, this was all surrounding mesenchyme. ये yellow में सारे endodermal cells हैं. अब इन ये जो rods of cells हैं that penetrate deep into the mesenchyme, your central cells of these rods, ये degenerate कर जाते हैं. When these central cells degenerate, so what you have is the development of tonsillar crypt. 20th week तक ये जो mesenchyme है, surrounding mesenchyme, this mesenchyme develops into lymphoid tissue, and then these lymphoid tissue, they collect together, they form aggregations which develop into nodules. Or up, what you have is the endoderm, solid structure, proliferation say it fills in the pouch, then ये जो solid structure थे, they take form of rods. These rods penetrate deeper into the mesenchyme. The mesenchyme surrounding these, अच्छा पहले तो ये कि जो rods के center में जो cell ये सब rods है, rod के the central cells in the rod, they break down. So अब ये जो structure बना, this develops into a crypt, a tonsillar crypt. But your surrounding, oh sorry, I'm so sorry. Surrounding cells जो हैं, ये surrounding cell, they develop into the mesenchyme. The surrounding mesenchyme develops into lymphoid tissue. These lymphoid tissue then aggregate and form nodules. Up to whatever part of this pouch remains, that develops into tonsillar fossa. और ये जो endoderm थी, जिससे ये rods develop हुए थे, this endoderm then develops into the epithelium of the tonsil. Is this clear? Do I make myself clear, beta? Okay. I guess I am making myself clear. Third pharyngeal pouch की बात कर लेते हैं. Now this pouch is extremely important. इसलिए इससे दो बहुत important structure develop होते हैं. That are the thymus and the parathyroid, inferior parathyroid. They both develop from the third pouch. इसलिए क्योंकि like the other two pouches, this pouch also has a dorsal wing and a ventral wing. Yeah. Over here would be the third pouch, between the third and the fourth arch. So this also has two wings, a dorsal wing and a ventral wing. Dorsal wing is solid wing, जबकि जो ventral wing है, that is a hollow structure. Now यहाँ पे आपने देखा था first pouch में कि इसकी भी दो wings थी, dorsal and ventral. Dorsal हमने कहा था developed in first pouch. In case of the first pouch, dorsal wing develops into the middle ear cavity. जबकि ये जो connection था with the pouch of the pharynx with the pouch, ये देख लीजिए, ये connection ये persist किया था, and this develops into the auditory tube. लेकिन इस केस में ये जो connection of the pouch with the pharynx, ये इधर, ये connection first it gets narrowed out and then it degenerates. So connection persist नहीं करता, connection degenerate कर जाता है. अब दो wings जो हैं ये persist करती हैं, एक dorsal wing जो कि solid है और एक ventral wing जो कि hollow है. अब 6th week में what happens is the dorsal wing develops into the inferior parathyroid, and the ventral wing, this develops into thymus, ये thymus. अब ये दोनों जो structures हैं, inferior parathyroid and the thymus, both these structures, they are bilateral. They're bilateral structures. They develop on both the sides. Okay? जिस तरह हमने ये भी किया था, they are all bilateral structures जो कि हमने develop किए थे because they both on the right and the left side. Both these structures, the inferior parathyroid and the thymus, they descend because the heart descends and the pharynx develops. The pharynx भी तो elongate करता है. So because of the elongation of the pharynx and descent of the heart, both these structures, they move down. Original development यहाँ पे थी, but then they move down. And 7th week में what happens is कि ये जो developing parathyroid gland है ना, this gets attached to the dorsal surface of the developing thyroid. अब midline में यहाँ पे you have this structure which is the thyroid gland. It starts from here and then this also descends as the pharynx elongates. The developing thyroid gland also descends and comes to lie in the neck. Now what happens is कि ये जो inferior parathyroid है, and this was descending with the thymus because of the descent of the heart and because of elongation of the pharynx. So on its way down into the neck, ये जो inferior parathyroid है, that got stuck to the posterior aspect या dorsal aspect of the developing thyroid gland. Develop कैसे हुआ? Inferior thymus को पहले कर लेते हैं. ये red में जो structure है, this is the developing thymus. Simple है. One on either side, they develop. As they develop, they move down. ये देख लीजिए arrow बना हुआ. It is moving caudally. It is also moving medially. In the midline, the two primordia of the thymus, they approach each other. They come close to each other and they fuse with each other, but they retain their individual structure. They come close to each other, they meet each other, they fuse with each other, लेकिन they remain separate structures. Okay? They have their own capsule, they have their own nerves, etc. You all know that. How does it develop? It develops from this endoderm of the pouch. Okay? These endoderm forms, multiplies, and then develops into solid rod. These solid rods then branch. Some of these cells, they form collections or form round masses. These masses develop into thymus corpuscles या Hassel corpuscles. Thymus corpuscles में क्या है? एक Hassel corpuscles हैं, फिर आपके cells हैं, epithelial reticular cells होते हैं, connective tissue होता है, capsule होती है. Thymus is made up of these four structures. So, recalling the histology of the thymus, ये जो endoderm है that forms solid rods, and this endoderm, then some of the cells, they form collections or they form rounded masses. These masses develop into Hassel's corpuscles. Other cells, they move apart. कुछ cells ने तो rounded masses बना दिए, Hassel's corpuscles बना दिए. The other cells, they move apart, but they still remain attached to each other by long processes. These cells form the epithelial reticular cells, and they form the reticulum of the thymus. In between, your mesenchyme रह गया, that develops into connective tissue sector. However, the surrounding capsule जो है ना, उसमें neurocrest cells आ जाते हैं, and hence the capsule of the thymus, this develops from neurocrest cells. So by the third month, lymphocytes जो है develop कर जाते हैं. These lymphocytes are hematopoietic cells or stem cells है, ठीक है, bone marrow से आते हैं, and they develop into T lymphocytes. अब ये T lymphocytes की arrangement जो है वो कुछ इस तरह से है कि surrounding area में the T lymphocytes, they are arranged in a very dense manner. So the surrounding area develops into the cortex. The central area में the T lymphocytes are arranged loosely, and the central area forms the middle. Clear? Do I make myself clear? Do we have any questions? Any questions? Anything you want me to repeat? अच्छा, ये thymus पे development of thymus is your university question. Solid marks का ये question होता है. ठीक है. ठीक है बेटा, मैं thymus के development आपको repeat कर देती हूँ. This is what I wanted to find out. Thymus develops from the third pouch. ठीक है, third pouch का भी हमने कहा है, वही उसके dorsal and ventral wings होते हैं. Dorsal wing solid होगा और ventral wing hollow out होगा. और ये भी कहा था कि जो इनका connection है with the pharynx, that degenerates. The dorsal wing develops into inferior paropharynx, jabki ventral wing develops into the thymus. And you know that these structures develop on either side, right and left side. The two developing thymus on either side, they move caudally and they move medially. and the two approach each other, they become close to each other, they fuse with each other, but still they remain their individual identity, meaning they have their own capsules. The two lobes of the thymus have their own capsules, they have their own connective tissue, they have their own nerve, etc. Everything is separate. और parathyroid का मैंने बताया था 70 degree, it descends with the thymus. It is, since they both develop from the same pouch, they develop together. The thymus, as it descends, it pulls the inferior parathyroid with it. But then this inferior parathyroid is trapped as this structure, the thymus is moving medially and caudally. This inferior parathyroid gets trapped posterior on the dorsal aspect of the developing thyroid gland. This is why the inferior parathyroid gland is attached to the posterior aspect, the inferior part of the thyroid gland. अभी हम इसको करते हैं. ये देख लीजिए कि even though it is developing from a higher pouch, third pouch से develop हुआ है, लेकिन it comes to lie on the lower end of the thyroid gland. Thymus पे वापस आ जाते हैं. I hope you remember the thymus histological structure. You had connective tissue, Hassel's corpuscles, epithelial reticular cells, and lymphoid tissue. Lymphoid tissue was arranged in the cortex and in the medulla, loose arrangement medulla, very dense arrangement of lymphoid tissue in the cortex. And I hope you remember that in the thymus, no lymphatic nodules are formed. No lymphatic nodules are formed in the thymus. Reason being, the lymphocytes in the thymus are of T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes होते हैं thymus में, and T lymphocytes never form nodules. B lymphocytes nodules बनाया करते हैं. आगे चलते हैं कि once again वही जो endoderm है of this pouch, this proliferates and form solid rods. ये जो rods हैं, some of these rods, they break down, they form aggregations, round masses around these solid rods. These round masses that separate out from these solid rods, they develop into thymic corpuscles or Hassel's corpuscles. So Hassel's corpuscles are basically formed from these endodermal rods that develop inside this pouch, third pouch. अब कुछ cells ने तो Hassel's corpuscles बना दिए. You have other cells that move apart, but these cells, they retain connection because इनके जो cells के processes हैं, they remain connected to each other. So these cells that move apart, they develop into epithelial reticular cells. और जो in between जो mesenchyme रह गई, that develops into connective tissue septa. So you have solid rods of cells that break down to form Hassel's corpuscles. You have some cells that move apart and make a network. These cells develop into epithelial reticular cells. Then, of course, there are other cells that make up the connective tissue septa. The surrounding mesenchyme जो है, यहाँ पे अब neural crest cells आ जाते हैं. So the surrounding mesenchyme that develops into the capsule, ये जो capsule बना रही है, इसकी surrounding mesenchyme, this mesenchyme is of neural crest origin. Third month पे, this structure, the developing thymus is infiltrated by lymphocytes. These lymphocytes are hematopoietic stem cells, and they form a dense aggregation called cortex and loose medulla. I hope it is clear to you. My time is up. Next time we'll complete this arch, inshallah. God bless you.